I've written a story to celebrate the 75th anniversary of VE Day. The story is called The Stray Soldier. The sound of artillery fire shook the ground. Mud and debris slid into the already thick trench. Todd shivered from the cold, but mostly from the fear of what was going to happen next. The explosions bombarded the surface, and it was so loud he could barely hear anything above the continual barrage of bullets and his red-faced commander screaming out orders just meters away. Strangely, there was a lull, just for a few seconds. Time to think. What was he doing here? Todd Carter was only 16 when he joined. He'd lied about his age when he and his friends went to sign up. It sounded so exciting with all the colourful posters and the stories of the countries they were going to visit, all the exotic food and the pretty girls he was going to meet. He'd make loads of money and send it back to his mum to help her out. She'd been great but wasn't so happy when she found out. He didn't know it was going to be like this. All the illusion evaporated as soon as they arrived. There was hardly any food or clean water. He was soaking wet all the time. Rats were scurrying here and there, and the mud was knee-deep. The smell of soil and gunpowder filled the air around him. Choking smoke clogged his chest and burned his eyes. He held a rifle with a sharp bayonet on the end of the barrel. Todd trembled as he lifted his arm to look at the weapon. If he was honest with himself, he didn't want to kill anyone. All he wanted to do now was go home. He'd made up his mind. I want to go home, Todd said out loud, but his words were lost in all the confusion. Nobody heard or cared what Todd Carter wanted. They had their own problems. It suddenly occurred to Todd that none of the soldiers, the friends he'd known in such a short time, ever came back from climbing over the top. Where were they now? Were they safe? Something deep in his stomach told him differently. He wasn't really that naive. He just didn't want to believe it. Nobody was going to come back. Everyone knew it, but no one spoke of it. Another barrage of 1,000,000 bullets and cannon fire sprayed the mud into his face again. He dropped to his knees in the muddied gloom. He suddenly felt his arm being violently snagged and opened his eyes. It was his commander, his eyes wild, as spittle flew from his open mouth, his uneven brown teeth moving up and down, but Todd heard nothing apart from a long, high-pitched whistle. The officer was raging now, pointing to the top of the trench, pulling and manhandling Todd's arm. Todd's mouth opened, his bottom jaw trembling uncontrollably as he got up. Suddenly his captain's voice burst through Todd's train of thought. "Get up that bloody ladder, soldier!" he screamed. He then pointed to Todd's rifle and continued bellowing, but Todd couldn't hear any more. He grabbed his weapon and began to climb the makeshift wooden ladder. Everything was swallowed up in a huge ball of confusion. He could see the wood grain on each of the rungs, right up close to his face. He could smell the disgusting stink of war. He could feel the heavy weight of the rifle pulling on his arm, almost speaking in actions, telling him to get back down in the trench. He could feel the weakness in his limbs, shortness of breath as he tried to breathe. His throat was dry and he couldn't swallow. Further and further up he went until he got to the lip, right at the top. There was another huge explosion that seemed to emanate from behind, and when he dared look down, he saw his commander. Not moving, just lying, half submerged in the brown sodden mud, his milky eyes open, but no sound coming from his open jaws. Todd was shaking so uncontrollably that the rifle slipped from his grip. It landed with a splat right next to the Captain Williams' body. The next second, Todd felt a violent push from behind and was launched over the top onto the battlefield. He found himself face down on the ground. He had a putrid taste in his mouth and spat out the oily water. He pushed himself upright. It was raining and the heavy downpour washed his dirty face, and the fresh water was welcome on his waiting tongue. Added to the sounds of war now were the boom of thunder and sharp white sheets of lightning. Todd eventually got to his feet and began to wander through the mass hysteria of bullets, screams and exploding soil. The sky was black. the rain storming down. A dense cocktail of mist and smoke clouded his way. Blinding flashes obscured his eyes, and whistling missiles flew through the air, only just missing his body. The stray soldier stumbled and fell on the uneven ground. There were bodies scattered all around, and he couldn't bring himself to look at their vacant faces. He fell to his knees and held his hands to his ears and just screamed and screamed, until a large blast erupted next to it and sent him tumbling down an embankment. He landed in a ravine, but his head was swimming and the sounds of violence diminished. Todd opened his eyes, but all he could see was black. He could still hear and feel the heavy bombardment in the distance, but couldn't see those bleached white lights that accompanied it. He noticed that it had stopped raining too. He touched his face. It was wet and didn't feel right. He could feel loose skin and the ionized taste of blood in his mouth. He was cold and wet and decided to see if he could find shelter. He scrambled along the ground blindly, not knowing where he was going. It just felt safer where he was. He touched something metal, which was obscured by branches and high grass. Todd pulled the debris away and found it was a large circular opening, a storm drain of some sort perhaps. He crawled inside and shuffled along the corrugated tube. It was knee-deep in water and smelly, but away from all that din. He sat for a while, pondering. Was he a coward? He didn't know, but what he did know was that he was still alive. After wrestling with his conscience, he got up and grappled and groaned his way along the pipe. He could hear his voice echo. He tried not to make any more noise than he had to. He didn't want to alert the enemy. With no gun, he wouldn't stand a chance. Not that he would pull the trigger anyway. Todd could hear muffled cries of soldiers and sounds of discharging weapons above his head. The tube vibrated with every explosion. He pictured in his mind's eye all the devastation that was taking place on top, and tears came freely to his eyes. So he kept moving. It didn't matter where, as long as it was away from all that badness. Soon his knees were sore from grating on the ribbed surface. He decided to stand and bend over to give his knees a rest. It was hard on his back as he clambered on all fours. Any pain he'd endured down there was nothing to what pain there was on the battlefield. It was still dense blackness inside, and the boy moved along the route at a steady pace. He came to a crossflow junction where the pipes went in 4 different directions. He soon observed that light was filtering in from above. He looked up and saw the drain cover with slits leaking in daylight. There was also movement. He saw shadows sifting across. The young soldier immediately dropped to the floor and scuttled into the shadows. He could hear faint voices calling out, but the language wasn't familiar. He suddenly realised he must be inside enemy lines. A shiver of dread went through his whole body. He kept perfectly still, breathing shallow, and continued to look up at the drain cover. He waited for the activity to stop, and when it did, he sighed. It was time to turn around. Shots rang out, reverberating through the metal tube, totally taking him by surprise. His heart quickened and his breathing spiked. Next, he heard splashing footsteps moving rapidly and saw the movement of torchlights. He panicked. Soon he'd be discovered. Todd desperately scuttled along, searching for somewhere to hide. He heard more splashing water not too far from where he was situated, but what direction? Suddenly the running stopped, and all Todd Carter could hear now were shouts from further back. He urgently looked for somewhere to hide. There was nothing. He decided to turn and take a chance, and turn left. He was breathing rapidly with panic, and tears were streaking down his dirty face, when he suddenly heard something. Psst! Todd stopped. The sound of the enemy was getting closer. Psst! The voice came again, and a small glowing light caught his attention. Todd looked immediately. There was a hole to his left, and the light was coming from in there. Not only that, but he saw a pair of glistening eyes in the dark. Oh, thank God, he whispered to himself, and made straight for the small opening in the pipe wall. He pushed himself inside next to the other soldier, who promptly covered the entrance with mud and leaves. It was virtually impossible to see in their hidey hole. It was too dark to see his rescuer, though. They crouched in the darkness and heard the soldiers move within meters of their hiding place. The two young men kept quiet, trembling with cold and terrified they'd be found out. The voices were loud and very close, close enough to touch. They were looking for something, but he knew it couldn't be him. They couldn't have known that he was in the pipe in the first place. It must be this other soldier. At least they were in it together now. Todd felt something move over his arm and knew there was something else in there with them. He tried not to call out and tensed with eyes clenched shut. His fellow soldier grasped his arm for support. The rat moved along his back and finally disappeared into a hole. Todd sighed louder than he wanted, and he held his breath as one of the soldiers stopped what he was doing. Todd could see a boot only a metre or so away from the lights in the tunnel. He held his breath and waited. The soldier was poking around and was almost on them when his superior officer called off the search. Within seconds, the soldiers were gone. When he felt it was safe, Todd climbed out of the hole, but a hand caught around his foot and was pulling him back down. He tried to grab hold of something solid to stop from slipping, but it was hopeless. He was dragged back into the abyss. Todd wanted to shout, but didn't want to alert the Germans. He found himself sliding down an embankment, the hand still gripping his ankle. Soon the two of them were free falling. They landed with an almighty splash. Todd soon found himself holding his breath, his foot now free. He was being sucked by the current and couldn't see in the solid black. He was trying so desperately to break the surface. It was cold and his strength was ebbing away. He felt the comfort of warmth. He could see his mum smiling and making him a meal. He was sat at the kitchen table. He was home. Todd was violently yanked from his thoughts by the urgency of being pulled out of the water and hungrily grasping for air. He coughed and spat out water as he was being dragged along a cold and muddied surface. He was left to catch his breath and rest, but it was all too much, and he fell into unconsciousness. Todd eventually opened his eyes and squinted into the brightness. There was daylight here, and the concrete beneath him was cold but dry. He pushed with all his strength and sat up. He was on his own. Whoever had saved him from drowning had gone. His clothes were only damp. He must have slept for many hours. He found that he was sitting on a concrete bridge support next to a river. The sun was rising, bringing warmth and melting the early morning frost. Todd blew in his hands and rubbed his arms. As he sat there, he realised something straight away. There was no gunfire. In fact, there were no sounds of war at all. What was going on? Soon, the loud rumble of traffic broke his stillness. It came from the bridge. He decided to go and investigate. He climbed up the banking to see for himself. He found a gap in the wall and stared at the rushing traffic. The vehicles were German. They were heading away into the mountains. They were leaving. He knelt there for quite a while and watched truck after truck disappearing into the mountain pass. Todd broke away and made for the safety of the trees. The smoke was clearing. The air smelled sweeter now. He found a jacket hanging on a branch of a tree. It was British, but the soldier was nowhere to be seen. He slipped it on. It was a bit too big for him, but it was warm and that's all he needed. He assumed that he was heading back to his army base. Soon he could hear high-pitched voices and hid behind an abandoned truck. The sounds were British and they were joyous. "The war is over! The war is over!" they repeated again and again. Todd walked out into the open without feeling scared. There were supply trucks handing out food and drink. He could see pockets of men drinking tea, smiling, something he hadn't seen in a long time. Someone spotted him and offered him a drink and something to eat, and he sat quietly. The war was indeed over. Thank you.